Imagine, if you will, it's a Sunday morning, the sun is shining, you've just woken up, you're feeling very optimistic about the day, and you want to fill the whole house with music. What do you choose? I know that in my case, I very often turn to one of Bach's Brandenburg concertos. And of the 6, it's very often number 3, or number 4, or even 5, and sometimes 6. But here's just to give you a little clue. This is what number 4 sounds like. Doesn't matter what mood you're in, this is going to lift your spirits. Or maybe number 3, because it's very famous. That's marvellous, isn't it? But the Brandenburg that I'm going to talk about today is number 5. Now, I've talked about it before once as a sort of sideline in my video about Jacques Lussier, and we will put a link up on the screen there so you can go to that video, and we'll put a link in the description as well. The Jacques Lussier trio is a trio, jazz trio, that played and interpreted Bach's music, and they do a fantastic interpretation of Brandenburg No. 5. But as I say, that's in the other video, and if you go to that video and you want to watch it, I will talk a lot about Bach and a little bit about his life and about the piece itself and some background information. So for all of that, go there. But to keep this video of a reasonable length, what have I done today? I've chosen a few different ensembles to go through and compare with the Brandenburg No. 5. Now, just a little bit on the Brandenburg No. 5. It was written or released in 1721. Johann Sebastian Bach was basically trying to win the support and sponsorship of the Margrave of Brandenburg, and he dedicated 6 of these concertos, if you like, to them. So the number 5 has a harpsichord, and this is really important because a lot of these concertos are influenced by Italian music of the period, like Vivaldi. And whereas they would often have a violin playing the solo parts, Bach has chosen the harpsichord, and it's not surprising for 2 things. He was a brilliant harpsichord player, and 2, this brand new double keyboard harpsichord that had just come onto the market, just being invented around the time that he wrote this. And so he really wanted to show off his prowess, probably to the Margrave of Brandenburg and to anyone else who would listen. So it's the soloists are basically harpsichord, flute and violin, and you'll hear that at certain recordings will balance these, certainly the violin and the flute, very well, where others will, that it might not be quite to your liking, shall we say. So the ensembles I've chosen now, I was thinking about the obvious ones, you know, the Trevor Pinnocks, the Neville Mariners, and all of those, the big famous British interpretations, shall we say, with the St. Martin's of the Fields Orchestra, Age of Enlightenment. But I've actually moved away from that selection for this video because I think there's been a number of other recordings, and there are hundreds of recordings, and I'm sure you've got your favourite, which have come to light and which I discovered during the research for this. So I've gone for the Concerto Italiano and the Akademie für Alte Musik in Berlin, the Concerto Italiano, as I said before, with Rinaldo Arsandrini, and that was recorded in 2016, and the Akademie für Alte Musik in Berlin was in 2021, and that's on Harmonia Mundi. And then I'm gone for the Concerto Cologne, which was from 2014, and it's on Berlin Classics. And this is an unusual one. Orchestra Mozart. Didn't really know the ensemble, but it's a recording by Claudio Abbado. Now, you think with Claudio Abbado, you think Beethoven, you think Brahms, you think the big symphonies. But apparently he recorded this in 2008 for Deutsche Grammophon. And I find it interesting, and I've chosen it because it's a live recording. And then lastly, but by no means least, Café Zimmermann, 2015 on Alpha Classics. I knew nothing about Café Zimmermann. I hadn't heard of them before until today, until the research of making this video. So let's get started. I think I want to start with Concerto Italiano and the beginning of the first movement. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move through each of, just take a snippet of the beginning of the first movement. So you just get a sense of how these different ensembles treat just the opening phrase. So this is Concerto Italiano. Now we're going to do Akademie für Alte Musik in Berlin. There we go. What we notice, of course, is that what a fast tempo they've taken it at. And also, did you notice how the sound opened up and is much lighter? So it's obviously in a bigger hall, and you get the sense that you're further away with them. So the next one will be in the Concerto Cologne. Now, this is the only time in this video I'm going to feature them, not for any specific reason. It's just the fact I didn't want to compare too many because it gets rather laborious, and you can always come back to it. If you find this opening section yourself appealing, let's just hear that. Now, that's, again, it's open. It's obviously in a recorded in a large space. You're a little bit closer in, but the tempo is much, much slower. And what I've discovered, and it's not a golden rule, but what I did discover in my research is that generally the more recent recordings, especially the traditional instrument recordings, tend to be taking at a faster tempo than the more traditional ones, and it was a sort of fashion to play it pretty fast. So let's move on now to the Orchestra Mozart with Claudio Abbado and that live recording which I promised you, and let's see indeed how he takes the opening. Now, what is interesting there, I find, is that it's quite closely microphoned, and you'll see that when we come back to it in a minute. And so you don't get a sense of a big hall, and it may have been in a very full hall, so the audience may have been very, very dominant and absorbing a lot of the echo and the sound. I don't know where it was recorded, but it's a much more intimate feeling despite the fact that it's live, isn't it? So now we're going to come on to Café Zimmermann. Now, I really like this. I can't hide my tendency to choose this one because of the fact, well, just listen for yourself and see what you think. Now, did you notice how well that's recorded? It's a very warm sound. It's a very full sound. It's not scratchy or thin. There is some ambience from the room. It's not as dead, well, dead is not the right word, as the orchestra Mozart, but there is a little bit of reverb, a little bit of echo, but just enough to give you the feeling that you're sitting more or less in the front row in a chamber hall, in a chamber room, which, of course, this is what this music was written for. So this was Café Zimmermann, and I want to stay with Café Zimmermann for a minute because I want to take you further into the first movement, and we're going to do that in a few steps and starts. Let's just see how we go with this. Now we're just a little bit further in. Now you hear the flute and the violin talking to each other. The harpsichord you can hardly hear. It's there in the background, as it should be, because normally you wouldn't hear the harpsichord anyway. So let's move forward a little bit. One of Bach's typical progressions. And now we're hearing the harpsichord in the background. Everything's beautifully balanced in this recording. Very nice deep bass notes too from the continuo. Oh, if you've got a good stereo. Now we're just going to move further along, and now the orchestra's got a bit louder because we're getting near the end now, and you will start to hear the harpsichord, hey, going a bit crazy. It's still in the background. Listen now. Right, so it's going into what we would normally consider a cadenza. But this cadenza is going to be about 3 or 4 minutes long. This is a real solo. Now I'm going to move it forward a little bit. It's getting near to the end. Wait for this. Isn't that wonderful? I mean, of course, the whole movement is usually about 9 minutes long. And that fantastic solo. And when you flip over to the Jacques Lussier version, you'll see that instead of Jacques Lussier, the pianist, doing that solo on the piano, because that solo is written, I mean, it's written, well, it's composed by Bach, written down, it's not totally improvised. He gives it to the drums. So it's an amazing drum solo instead of harpsichord, which I think is a brilliant technique. So that's something worth checking out. But we've got to the end of the first movement, but I thought maybe it would be interesting just to listen to the ending of the orchestra Mozart, to see how do they handle that, just to hear that live, little bit of the live solo, to see to compare the difference there. I'm going to pop it on there. The flutes are much nearer to us, aren't they? I'm not sure about the balance here. It's a bit all over the place. Now, and now the engineers are going to bring the harpsichord further forward than maybe it would be normally. Now we're going to move up towards the end. Here we go, the same part as before. For a live recording, I find it absolutely fabulous. And when I talked about the balance there, it's not important, because when you listen to the whole thing in perspective, it makes sense. What they actually, the Deutsche Grammophon engineers have done, actually, they've just gradually dropped back the flute as the harpsichord comes forward, because a harpsichord can't play very loud. It would normally be drowned out by all the strings in the soloists together. So they've just very cleverly brought that in. So we're hearing it in a way that you could never hear it live. The other instruments would have to play very, very, very quiet to be able to get the harpsichord to the forward like that. So yes, we are privileged, and that's one of the great things about actually having recorded music for us. So now let's move on to the second movement, shall we? Because in the second movement, we've got, I'm going to start with, again, back to the Concerto Italiano. Listen to the second movement and have a glimpse with this one as to which one you like. We'll just start with this opening. this second movement is so important, because obviously, as you can see, it's a marvellous contrast to the first. But for me, one of the things I find really important is the balance between the flute and the violin here. How they come together. Are they talking to one another? Are they communicating with one another? Is one just waiting to jump in to play their part, or are they really listening to each other and playing as a really tight ensemble? It's two lovers communicating with one another, two people with passion and interest listening to one another. Let's listen to the Akademie für Alte Musik from Berlin. See how they tackle this challenge. It's very, very different, isn't it? The approach is completely different. Of course, we've got a much bigger acoustic, so that means the sound of the instruments are blending together whether we want them to or not, and that's the, should we say, the natural way of doing these things, of playing them. And Bach is often played in churches, but it is important to remember that these pieces were chamber pieces and probably would have been performed, well, certainly not in churches, but in people's private houses. So let's go back to the Café Zimmermann and see how they take this section. I find that marvellous. the dialogue between the flute and the violin, not only is the phrasing fabulous, the tonal quality, the timbre of the violin and the timbre of the flute are so beautifully balanced. It's not a harsh rasping sound against a warm flute sound. No, they're both playing in a very warm part of the register, which actually I like. Maybe it's the romantic in me, but I do enjoy that, and it kind of matches the name Cafe Zimmermann. It sounds a little bit cafe, doesn't it? And it's just that smoothness. Well, let's just stay with them to go to the end of the second movement. Here we go. Now, a little sharper now to add a different colour. That violin is brighter, isn't it? Just marvellous. The range of colours that these musicians are pulling out to make every repeat of every phrase unique and new, but still have a contextual whole, is wonderful in my opinion. But I like all of them in their own way. But let's move on now to the third movement, and we're back to the Concerto Italiano for the beginning, the opening section of the third movement. Here we go. I find that's great, and the acoustic really helps the ensemble. It's not so large, it's not so echoey that everything is blended together. Everything is still nice and precise, and the flautist, the way the flute is playing bop, bop, very nice and staccato, is just giving a nice lift. And of course in this 1721 version of this, what we could call a harpsichord concerto in many ways, because the harpsichord's coming back here, you can really hear it starting to come to the fore. In this version, Bach has added a cello as well for this Brandenburg, and that really adds, I think, a lot to it apart from the continuo. So let's move on to now my track number 15, irrelevant to you of course, and this is the Academy for Alta Musik, so we're going to listen to that bigger acoustic and hear them open this third movement. that leaves us, of course, just with the very end of that third movement. And for that, and to conclude this little talk, I'm going to end with, you've guessed it, the Café Zimmermann, just taking us to the end. Listen to see how they do this for us. And that is, for me, marvellous. I do like all the versions, genuinely, otherwise I wouldn't have picked them. But the Akademie for Alte Musik in Berlin, that really gives you the feeling that you're there in the Chapel Royal or wherever, listening to this wonderful group of musicians performing extremely well together. Café Zimmermann is like they're playing in your home. And the Concerto Italiano is like, yes, they're in a little private, in a large hall, in a private house. You can think of sort of Versailles or one of the wonderful German houses of the period, or Austrian. And then, of course, my thanks also go to Concerto Cologne, which we only heard once, which is also a wonderful recording. So try them all out. I'll put all the links in the comments below so that you can listen to them and compare. Give me your feedback, please. I would love to know which one you preferred or what your favourite version is. Thank you very much if you have been watching, and I'll see you in the next video.